everybody. It's great to have you on our SermonMax Podcast. Man, this is episode 2, and we're just thrilled that you've joined us and taken time out. The SermonMax Podcast is all about trying to help executive leaders, senior leaders of churches really advance their mission faster than they would alone. And so we're trying to build a great community of leaders who can speak into our lives, into our church's lives, in order to help us advance that mission. So today we have Greg Ligon, and as a friend of mine described him, he is the guru of multi-site. And so we're thrilled to have him. We're going to talk multi-site, but we're also going to talk succession. He's doing a ton of work around succession, and so we're just thrilled to have him. So Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Kenny. It's a real privilege and real excited about the new work that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Today, we want to just ask you some questions and just get some great insights from you just around what it looks like to walk through succession. But also, we will get around to multi-site. A lot of people I know will be viewing this because of the work you've done around multi-site. We'll hit that more at the end. But really, the first few questions I have for you is centered around succession and leadership planning and some of those type things. And the first one really is, what trends are you seeing really recently around succession and what churches are doing and the successes they're having around it?
Sure, you bet. So succession has been a growing issue over the last decade or so. Actually, when I was back at Leadership Network, we published a book on succession called The Elephant in the Boardroom. It was an amazing book, still is a good book. It's one I recommend to folks. There weren't a whole lot of people who were willing to have the conversation about it. Senior pastors didn't want their elders to know they were thinking about maybe moving on or thinking about moving to the next season, and elders didn't want their senior pastor to know they were thinking about it. The book, although it had great content, didn't sell a whole lot of copies, but great.
Nobody wanted it on their shelf, right? Nobody wanted to have that sitting up front.
Yeah. We always joked if there were a way we could have it shipped in some kind of concealed package, then we probably could have sold a whole lot more copies of it. But that conversation has only continued to heat up as we have a lot of churches that were founded by senior pastors who are now reaching that age of retirement, although most of them don't like to talk about retirement. They're beginning to talk more about moving to the next season of ministry, which I love as well. I don't think any of the disciples ever retired. They just moved on, continue their ministry. Hopefully most of our senior pastors won't have to have the same demise as most of the disciples did, but they are talking about moving on to the next season of ministry. And I think one of the things that is really important, I think, in the conversation about succession is to think about it from the perspective of time. And there are two Greek words in the New Testament for time. One is chronos and one is kairos. And chronos time it's on the calendar, it's a schedule. And so oftentimes when we hear conversations about succession, we think in terms of when I reach a retirement age, when I reach 65 or 70 or whatever that age is that you have in your mind, or whenever my church reaches I've been there for 25 years, or we're celebrating our 40th year as a church, or perhaps it's whenever I have enough money in my retirement account in order to be able to live post that. And so those are all the chronos kind of time thoughts in terms of succession. But I think it's really important to think about it more in terms of kairos time. And so what's the right time? What's the right time for the leader? What's the right time for the church? What's the right time for the next leader? As all three of those pieces are really important in a successful succession. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do as I work with churches in succession, is to help them not just get to retirement, but to get to that kairos time that's really best for the leader and for the church.
Yeah, so when you think about that, what are key, if I'm headed into that and trying to find that right time, what are the key characteristics of that? What should I be looking for as a leader?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been working with the last year is I've got a couple of groups now of senior pastors that are 55 and up, and they're beginning to have this conversation. We call it the Lead Wells Senior Pastor Finishing Well cohort. And these are all guys they're not ready to turn over the keys, but they are wanting to begin to think about how do they finish strong, and then what are the things they're going to do once they get past that time, when that kairos time comes for them. And so that's one of the questions I've asked a lot is, how did you know when it was time? And several of the answers I get are around ideas like, I knew that whenever it came time for another capital campaign, it just wasn't in me. or I knew that I didn't want to be around for the next conversation about what do small groups need to look like in this era. So there were just some of the things that had previously given me life and I felt like I had vision around, that I just realized that wasn't a part of what was next. One of the pastors I'm working with currently just said he's a very visionary, kind of get the plan in place kind of guy. And he said, I realized that God wasn't giving me the next vision for the church. And so that was one of the indicators for me that it was time for me to begin to pass the reins off to a younger leader. I think the other thing too is just with reference to that, the younger leader, just reviewing one of the books that there's a number of books that are coming out now around succession, particularly for pastors who have gone through that process and telling their story. And Bryant Wright from Johnson Ferry Baptist Church has one out, and so I was reading a bit of his story today. And one of the kind of the moments for him was he had a conversation with a leader after an elder meeting one night, in one of those conversations in the parking lot, and he said, this leader said, you know what, that lobby that we have in our church is just not very appealing to millennials.
Right.
And Brian, it's a beautiful space. It's this large, tall ceilings, glass, gorgeous open space. And this leader said, yeah, but that's just not what millennials are looking for. And so for him, that was a moment for him when he thought, you know what, it's time for there to be a younger leader, somebody who has a greater ability to connect with this generation. And so those are a couple of things, that realizing there's an ability to not connect, realizing that there's just some things that you've been there, done that, and you'd like to hand that off to the next guy. And so those are a couple of things. They're a little bit less tangible than one might think. The other thing too, I think that one of the drivers for the reason that people stay as long as they do is certainly the financial side of things. And particularly in churches that have, if they're a founding pastor situation, for many years, they were well underpaid.
Right.
And so as a result, they know they got to work another 5 to 7 years in order for the 403B plan or their retirement, their investments to be able to allow them to have a healthy retirement income. That's one of the things I think that is a factor for them. And one of the things is we work with churches and helping them to understand that oftentimes can be an issue where you help the church see it might be the best thing for the church, going back to this Kairos time, for us to move to a new leader. We also want to make sure we're taking good care of the person who led us to this point in time, and sometimes that involves some financial arrangements that come as a part of that as well. So those are some of the kinds of things some of the kinds of issues that senior pastors are looking toward, that are cues for them that it's time to move to that next season.
Speak to us just briefly. I know that you just mentioned it in passing about some senior leaders really invested early at a low pay rate, and then all of a sudden they're having to stay an extra 5 years to make up for that 5 years. But the church would never be where it is without them. And this is honestly really a unique church thing, because if it was in a business setting, this wouldn't be the case. What are you seeing churches doing? Because that's not a good reason to stay, right? It's got to be unnerving for a senior pastor to walk out of the lobby, think it looks great, someone say, hey, this place is getting dated, and for them to go, oh crud, but I got to stay for 5 years because I got to figure out how to pay for my mortgage or how to pay for retirement. That's not the reason any of us want the great leaders to stay. We want them to stay for vision and all those things. So what are you seeing churches do in order to create the opportunity to start the off-ramp a little bit in order to have a good succession plan?
Right. So there's a number of models. Every church is a little bit unique in how they do that. There's some that have begun to establish what they're basically catching up. And so over a 5-year period, they say, hey, we're going to commit over the next 5-year period. We're going to keep your salary flat, but we're going to add X number of dollars that will help get you to where you should have been had you been there, had we been paying you appropriately all along the way. And there's a variety of vehicles that you can do that. There's a thing called a rabbi fund that you can do that is one of the vehicles. There are just certain other investment vehicles that the church can use as well. And so that's one of the ways that they're doing some catch up with reference to that. Another model on the other end of that spectrum is an agreement to continue to pay the senior pastor even after they've stepped out out of the senior pastor role. It may be at a reduced salary, but they're continuing to get some compensation that helps for that period of time, while also giving the church the opportunity to bring in a younger leader that will help continue the vision, continue the story of the church. In most cases, at least the ones we're working with, the senior pastors had a great run, so it's not an issue of they're no longer a great leader. It's just that it's time for a new leader. Right. And we see that throughout Scripture too. And so this enables the church to be able to continue to keep that story of success, of health, of growth, continuing by bringing in a new leader, while at the same time honoring the person who's led them to that point in time. And so there are lots of different variables associated with that, but those are a couple of ways that we're seeing churches begin to do that.
I think churches have to be innovative in this area, because what we all know in church world is no one wants to talk about money. No one wants to talk about salaries. And in turn, it leads us to awkwardness and bad conversations and bad moments. And it really, I think it puts us in the corner sometimes, versus just saying, hey, in reality, we're having a money issue. And none of us want to say that. We almost need leaders in the room to say that for you. Hey, if I would have started out the way you did, I would have a money issue. Can we have a conversation about that?
You're right. It's largely an issue of transparency, and it's very difficult for a senior pastor. For a senior pastor who is what I think of, going back to Jim Collins' level 5 leadership, who has that level of humility and sincerity, it's hard for them to have that conversation around money with their leaders. And so that's one of the values that I bring when I come in and work with a church, is because I can help to broach some of those conversations with their leadership. And once it's on the table, the reality is, just like you said, many leaders, if they've got leaders that are elders or whatever their governance structure is, many of those folks they owned a business, or they've been a CEO of an organization. So it's a totally different scenario when they step into retirement. There's certainly financial arrangements that they have when they step out as a CEO into retirement. If they own their own business, they sell it, they've got this body of cash that they have that a senior pastor just doesn't have. But those conversations are important, and that transparency is really important. The other thing that I've discovered as I've been working with churches is when the senior pastor takes the initiative to come to the leadership and say, I think it's time for us to begin talking about that. In every case that I've worked on so far, the elders have been relieved and have been happy and have been encouraged and have complimented and given praise to the senior leader for having the maturity to be able to have that conversation in the leadership shops, to be able to say that. One of the recent conversations I was in, one of the elders said, I'm so glad you said that. We were afraid it was going to be like my dad, and we had to force the keys away from him and tell him to stop driving. So that transparency issue is really key for a healthy succession.
Yeah, and I got to believe that it says as much about the leader or as much about the board as it does the leader, that there's got to be a level of trust. When we think about Lencioni stuff, there has to be a level of trust that goes into that, because I think I would think as a leader, if I was having that conversation, I'd be like, are they going to look at me and go, oh, good, how about tomorrow? And then it's, oh, crud, we got a problem. So I guess one of the questions I had from Greg is, I worked with, and we had Chris on last week, and it was odd at the time when we were working together, but he was 30-something years old and started talking about a succession plan. And I'm thinking, why are we talking about this? But he called it, if I get hit by a bus, what happens? Which right. I look back now and go, man, it's a great conversation. But the thought that I had in preparing and reading some of your material and all this type of stuff was, is there ever a way to create a culture of where you have a conversation about this continuously? And maybe early on it isn't, if I get hit by a bus, what do we do? But maybe then it moves into a leadership development. Hey, we're doing these things in order to cultivate leaders and see who the great leaders are in our church. And then ultimately it leads to a succession discussion. That might be pie in the sky, but I just went, is there a way to create a culture versus one day I walk into the elders and say, I think I need to think about succession?
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's really key. Churches, most of the churches we're working with, they're large, healthy churches. They understand their greatest need, their greatest challenge, and their greatest need is leadership. It's also the greatest priority in terms of really trying to figure out how do we identify, equip, build leaders, both for internally for staff, and for the senior pastor role eventually, but just for staff along the way. We all know that the best hires, as long as the church is healthy and you like the direction you're headed, the best hire is somebody from inside. because you're really wanting somebody that will continue that story, maybe take it to a new chapter, may have a little bit different inflection than the former senior leader did, but we want that continuity. And so I think there's really a lot of value in that. One of the churches that's been one of the most visible is Southeast Christian Church, and of course they've very much from the beginning, Bob Russell identified Dave Stone was the senior pastor. As soon as Dave Stone stepped into the senior seat, he identified Kyle Eidelman, who's the current senior pastor, so that was very much a part of their process. There are others that have done that as well. Chase Oaks Church, it wasn't from the very beginning, but there was a long period of time whenever Gene Getz announced that he was going to be retiring, and Jeff Jones stepped into that role, and they had a season of transition. But it was because there had been that kind of internal culture of developing leaders is really important.
No, that's good. How are you seeing churches find good young successors? What does that identification process look like? Is it all external? Are they bringing people internal? Are they using key mechanisms to do that?
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority are using internal candidates. And there are ways. It's one of the things that when we come in to work with the church on succession is to help them to be able to identify a couple of things. One is what do they need in the next leader of the church? There are too many times when a church says, okay, Bob's been our senior pastor for 40 years and he's done a great job. We just need to find another Bob. In reality, maybe you do, but more likely you don't. You need a new leader for a different season with a different set of gifts. Different set of gifts from somebody who founded a church and somebody who's going to lead a church after it's been well established. And so that's part of the thing we do is to help them discern what it is that they need. And then if they have internal candidates, we have a process that we help them evaluate those candidates and even help them to put them in a development program that would help them to get extra reps at some of the things that maybe they need strength on, time of evaluation. So internal is great, and that's one of the things we're looking for, somebody who will help carry their story forward and who has the right gifts in order to be able to do that. There are three things that we look at when we're working with a church on succession. One is the future of the leader, the current leaders. We've talked a little bit about that. What's that going to look like once they've taken a step away from the lead pastor seat? We're also looking at what is the future leader going to look like? And then finally, and this is the one that most people don't really think a lot about, is we call it productive pathways, but what are the pathways of health for a church as they move through this time? Oftentimes churches just assume that they're going to have to put some things on hold, they're going to have to slow down, but we really believe if you do the hard work of taking care of your leader, identifying the right leader, and then the most key thing that churches really typically don't do a great job of is to create that on-ramp for the new leader and really have a really solid plan for that. But if you do those things, you can continue the momentum of the church. You don't have to take that step back. But it takes some time, it takes some processes, it takes having the right conversations in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking back to Chase Oaks succession plan, and I had the privilege of being around for that and being on staff for a lot of that. And one of the things that was a key moment in that process was we went into a building campaign. And I will never forget Gene Getz stepping on stage and saying, hey, everybody, you need to get behind this. We're going forward. And Jeff's the guy to lead us here. And I'm interested to hear you talk about a productive pathway. I think there's got to be a power in seeing for a season these two guys going together down a path, and versus they're just, I'm out and someone else jumping, he's in. Yep. There's a power of being together for a season.
You bet. And Jeff, if I were talking to Gene and Jeff, if they were on this call today, they would say yes to that, and they would say that theirs was too long. And their initial plan was a 7-year process. Yeah. And that was after it had been announced. And so they got about 3 years in, looked at each other and said, it's time. So that was good that they were able to, Gene had the humility and Jeff had the leadership capability to really be able to do that and to step in. And that's one of the great success stories, I think, of succession in the church. Right leader, right story, taking the church in a new direction, but consistent with the story and the value of what had been Fellowship Bible Church North. So great story there. Yeah, so that's what part of the thing is, understanding what that overlap needs to look like. We talk about creating some opportunities for there's a lot of work that goes ahead, and then once the announcement's been made to the congregation, there's a lot of work that follows that too. If you're seeking an outside candidate, of course, there's that process. The search process is really important, but even if you have an internal candidate you're putting forward as a new person, there's a really important process that needs to happen. We typically, we think it's best to have 18 to 24 months to do all of that, and creates the right pace for some of those kinds of things to happen.
That seems very wise. Thank you for the discussion around succession. I know you're leading a group. If people want to go farther with you in regards to this, I would encourage them to, I'm assuming, just to email you, and we will put your email address out there.
Perfect.
As well.
You can email me, Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, Greg at Ligon Group. Just reach out to Greg. He'd love to have you in a group and just even talk about it. And
you bet.
This is tricky. Sometimes you need a safe place just to have this conversation. As you said, most people didn't want to put a book on the shelf about it, and calling you may be the safest thing you can do. So.
Yeah, there are a lot of books on the shelf now, but one of the things that I would last thing I'll say about this is that's one of the other oftentimes missteps in terms of succession, is not developing a process that's unique to your church. I've heard lots of churches say, oh yeah, we read this book, or we have a friend down the street who just went through succession and we're going to do it just like they did. And sometimes that works, but more often than not it doesn't, because the person you read about in their book has a different culture than what the culture of your church is. You're a different kind of leader. Same thing with the church down the street. And so it's important to have someone to help guide you through that process. And we love the opportunity to do that. As you mentioned, you can email me. You can just go out to the website too, at ligongroup.com, and go to cohorts. And there's all kinds of information about the Lead Senior Pastor Finishing Well cohort if you're interested in getting involved with that. I'd love to talk with you.
No, that's great. I know that Chris, last week when he joined us, we never got around to it, but they went through a process of merging with another church and had an outside voice, and it was very helpful to help facilitate difficult conversations and transitions and all those type things, and to really identify how they were going to navigate the future as well. If I don't talk multi-site with you, there's a group of people out there who are going to be like, this is the multi-site guy. We got to talk multi-site real fast. Tell me, what trends are you seeing now in multi-site, and what's the trends out there?
Sure, you bet. Some of the things that are happening were happening. We've got this marker in time now, COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? I think everybody's pretty much well over it and ready to move on. Hopefully, if you aren't, just in the terms of church world, you need to move on. It's time to move on. But who you've got now is your new normal. Figure out what that looks like, and let's move forward. But there were a lot of things that were happening. Some of the trends that are happening now had already begun to happen pre-COVID, but were accelerated. And of course, the one that's probably most obvious is the use of online. And I was with in one of my cohorts with a group of senior pastors on March the 10th of 2020, and that was the night that we were actually at dinner, and one of the guys looked up from his phone. He'd gotten an alert on his phone, and it was the night that they noted that the March Madness basketball, I'm also a basketball fan, college basketball fan, there would be no crowds for March Madness. And by the time we got together the next morning, of course the NBA had shut down, and we learned that by the time these guys got home on the weekend, there would be nobody gathering for worship. And so getting online, it was a crazy week. Getting online was the number one thing. And so we saw a lot of really great kind of early innovation that people actually moved pretty quickly. We were fortunate that there have been some pioneers that had already led the way. And for example, Life Church had developed an online platform that a lot of churches were able to just immediately hop on. And so we saw a lot of innovation in terms of the online worship experience. And that was really good. And we were able to respond. And as you and I have talked about, Kenny, I think one of my disappointments was, in addition to the online worship, there began to be some innovation around how do we use online as a part of our discipleship pathway. As we were in a season of, in some cases, a year or more, in other cases, 12 to 16 weeks of not being able to gather in buildings, people began to say, okay, how do we keep our growth going online? And so we saw some cool stuff begin to develop in terms of integrating online stuff with your discipleship pathway.
Right.
A lot of that kind of got slowed down, or in many cases just stopped whenever people started to be able to get back in the building. And part of that was a resource challenge in terms of how do we keep developing that kind of content when we're now back, we're having to do our in-person stuff and do that. And so some of that. So I know you're probably, some of the work that you're doing, and that's one of the things I'm excited about what you're doing with SermonMax, is there's some opportunities to really curate some of that content to create opportunities for online discipleship stuff. But anyway, online is a piece of that. I think one of the things that happened actually during COVID, we had some of the clients I've worked with launched campuses during COVID, and they launched them online initially.
Wow.
Some of those are continuing to have that kind of aggressive online presence, and really moving beyond that just being a simulcast experience of what happens in the building, but they're really looking at that as a different community. And they have an online campus pastor, and they're doing a little bit different production with reference to what that message looks like online. And so that's one of the ways that we're seeing multi-site growing campuses grow from that perspective. Another thing you mentioned from your conversation last week was mergers. We actually thought we might see a little bit more of this get accelerated coming out of COVID. It's not been as rapid as we thought it might be, but we still think that's going to be a part of the future, particularly as we see some denominations that are struggling, and we've got these buildings that are going to become available. And there's just a lot of opportunity to be able, I like to reference it as redeeming buildings, redeeming church buildings for the kingdom, and instead of it being turned into a coffee shop, looking for ways to take these, in many cases, great facilities, but the leadership or the financial model just hasn't worked for them. And so looking for ways to merge with healthy congregations that can help to extend the gospel through these really great facilities. I think we're going to see more of that along the way. Another thing that we saw, and I think this has been accelerated, is the microsite churches. This has been a part of the conversation for a number of years, but accelerated during COVID. There's a couple of models underground down in Tampa that literally is a collection of small microsite churches. They don't have a large gathering. It's these smaller house church, or maybe a little bit bigger than that, gatherings that are all under this umbrella of underground. There's some similar things happening in Kansas City there as well. But then also another of the models is what's happening at 12 Stone Church in the Atlanta area, and they have 12 Stone Home, and it is literally they're expanding not just in the Atlanta area, but in other parts of the country where people are gathering in homes to be together for worship and in very unique environments. So it's not just in homes, but it's in other places where people gather, whether it's a gym on a Sunday morning or a club that might have something going on the night before, but nothing on Sunday morning. And so they're gathering there with folks. And so I think there's some continuing growth that's going to happen as a result of microsites.
That's exciting just to think about the diversity that could come of a difficult situation. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in regards to online campuses. How's that different than running a video and like just a normal, hey, we have an online service, but what are you seeing as the differences, best practices even, of online campuses?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two camps. One are, like you just said, there are a whole lot more that are doing online, but after COVID, they're more doing it because they had to. But a large percentage of those, I would say, have gone back to just it being a live stream. Now there have been some improvements because there's now a greater understanding of the audio quality, and so those that are even doing a live stream, typically the ones that are doing it best have a kind of dedicated audio line. They have a dedicated camera so that they know there's a separate stream that's going to the live simulcast that's a better experience in terms of audio and video visual quality. And so that's happening across the board. And then, as mentioned, there's another group that has really taken that to the next level. Some of the things that they started doing during COVID in terms of having a pre-produced message that was not initially different in the focus from what was happening in their live campuses, but a different kind of format. So it may be a little bit shorter. It may have a little bit different feel. Even worship experiences. There are those that are really committed to this online campus thing that have also producing their worship experiences in such a way that those can be given online as well. In many cases, they're doing that by having a dedicated worship team that is a part of this working in that, if they have the capacity to do that. In other cases, they're using their existing worship team and they're going and they're building, they build a library of worship music that's produced specifically for the online campus. So you've got that online experience. But then the thing I'm most excited about, and going back to what I was talking about earlier, is some of those that are beginning to look at their online campus is not just what happens on the weekends or what happens in the worship experience, but what really happens from Monday to Saturday in between, or Monday to Friday, depending what their worship opportunities are, what's happening in those contexts. And some of those that started online groups have continued that. That's been actually a very successful thing. A couple of venues where they've discovered that actually works better than in person. In many scenarios is if you have any kind of a new membership class. During COVID, people said that the attendance at those kind of courses and those experiences increased in terms of participation, and also the interesting thing was the level of transparency was greater because people tell their story about how they got there. And then the same thing for families with young kids. If you can do your community group, your online group at 8:30 and your kids are already in bed, you're not having to worry about if they're upstairs at somebody else's house tearing something up, you can really be more focused and more engaged. And so that's another way. And then the last thing I'll just say is that just some really unique things in terms of using podcasts. Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, Brian, their senior pastor will come to me in just a second. Brian has a podcast that he does every week called A Beer with Brian. Right. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to reach into a certain segment that would be intrigued by that topic, and then using that as an entryway, as a connection point to the church. And they talk about provocative topics and all that kind of stuff. So those are some of the kind of things that are happening online.
Yeah, I think I think it's natural, right? You go through this massive thing called COVID. Everybody makes this massive shift over online. There's so much energy piled into it. And then the phrase I hear all the time, did hear all the time, was relaunch, right? Everything was about a relaunch. And the amount of energy that went into that, just trying to get people back on the campus. And resources shifted, people shifted. You went from having any resource you need online to now all of a sudden you're back to there's 2 people running around, hopefully, maybe thinking about it. And then there's a catch your breath moment. And I feel like that might be where we're at as a church community, is that we're in this, okay, and now we've learned a lot. What do we need to do? And one of the things that we're looking at trying to help churches do is create discipleship tools and to really take social media and those platforms and turn it toward discipleship. And like we were talking to a church yesterday and saying, hey, what if we created a newsletter that they got? It had reels in it, it had blogs in it, and it basically laid out a devotional piece for your members. They could sign up every week. They get a newsletter on Monday, and it's just 4 or 5 minutes, but it connects back to the sermon. It connects, and it keeps your sermon, keeps everything in the forefront all week long. And if they want to tag in a Bible study on top of it, read through the Bible, read through the New Testament, whatever, they can do that. But it's a great way to have conversation with your kids or with your spouse or just you individually. And it just almost replaces that devotional book. Nothing wrong with those at all. It basically puts it in your hand, the church, just trying to disciple people intentionally instead of asking them to always come to the church for discipleship. It's just trying to figure out how you do things a little different. You have more resources, we have more tools. So how in the world do we leverage them in this season? So it's definitely one of the things I think will come. It's just, I think right now can we catch our breath? And I think in the fall, we're going to see a lot of innovation from the church. And I'm excited about that for what they're looking at doing. Last question for you. What impact have you seen that the online campuses, everything's gone online, has any of that the fact that shift has happened, how has that impacted the thought around multi-site now? Does that make sense what I'm at? There's such a movement toward online church. And then we have these multi-site campuses. Has there been any impact from your perspective on that?
If I understand, this would be my response to that question. I think that one of the things that's happening in terms of how the online is used in many cases is it's used not as a permanent location for people, but it's used almost as an initial gathering place. And so that's one of the things. So even if you're looking at an existing church, you're looking at one of their online campuses, you may be able to, you look at the metrics and you look at where people are viewing from, and one of the things that people are getting to do more aggressively, if they've got 150 people logging in from a set of URLs that are an hour away from them or 30 minutes away from them or across the country, in the case of Crossroads, they're looking at that as potential for launching a campus. So they're using it as a part of their strategy to launch physical campuses as well. It gives them the ability to be able to test some things without the expense of the capital expense of building out a campus or leasing a facility or whatever. So I think some of that's going to happen. I think the other thing that's really interesting to me, and nobody's done this study, at least not that I've found yet, but pre-COVID, we talked about the fact that if you were in church 1.7 times a month, I think was the number at that point in time, that was what people thought was you were actively engaged, right? I've heard that number has actually gone down some in terms of the number of times that people are physically in the building. But my hunch, my hypothesis that I'd love to have somebody help me test, is that I think that probably people are engaged more than what they were pre-COVID, because they're able to have that experience online, and because it's such an improved experience that they may actually hear the message 3 times a month as opposed to 1.7 times a month, even though they aren't physically in the building. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting thing. I think that online has created for us as well.
Yeah, I wrote down the first: more engaged, less present, which I think that's challenging for churches, right? To think about, because we've always measured engagement by presence. And so to start flipping that a little bit, I think is a challenge for us.
It's really important. And it was like during COVID, I'm talking to senior pastors and they're like, we're looking at at that point in time, people were talking about how do we measure engagement from online. Do you look at the Facebook numbers? Do you look at the YouTube numbers? Do you look at who stayed on? What are those things? And they're like, this can't be engagement. They were, even on the best numbers, YouTube, they were only engaged 20 minutes. We've got them for 45 minutes or an hour on Sunday morning. And I would always say, you're kidding yourself if you think you're engaged on 45 minutes or an hour, because there's, in fact, maybe even less, because there's more distractions around them, whatever.
My wife's trying to make sure I'm engaged fully for 45 minutes while I sit there. So.
Right. And so that whole area of engagement is another thing maybe we could talk about sometime on another podcast, but that's a different conversation than it has been in the past. I think in a healthy way. I think we're moving in some really healthy directions with reference to that.
No, that's great. I first want to say thank you for being on our podcast, and it's great to have you, your expertise. Thank you for the impact you've had on the kingdom for so many years, and through your work with Leadership Network and what you're doing with Ligon Group now, and it's just huge. And so I can't encourage all of you enough. If you have questions around multi-site or leadership, succession, definitely reach out to Greg. He will be a great resource to you. We're thrilled that you're joining us. And so thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to check out the SermonMax podcast. And I just want to say we truly value your time and hope it's beneficial. We look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day.